Charles Montgomery tapped his fingers rhythmically on the mahogany desk, his eyes fixed on the window that overlooked his sprawling estate. Beyond the carefully manicured lawns, vineyards stretched as far as the eye could see, a constant reminder of the life he had built from the ground up. Every inch of this place was his achievement, his control. And yet, with each passing day, it felt like something was slipping away. That something was his daughter, Eliza. He threw the file down, the latest report from his private investigator. Photos of Eliza arm in arm with that reckless playboy, Julian Carter, stared back at him. His blood boiled just looking at them. Julian, with his flashy sports cars and empty promises, was the embodiment of everything Charles despised. Scandals trailed the man like a shadow, and yet Eliza, his only daughter, seemed blinded by his charm. "She's ruining her life," Charles muttered under his breath, feeling a surge of frustration. He had given Eliza everything. A privileged life, the best education, and endless opportunities. And this was how she repaid him. He picked up the phone, his mind racing. Confronting her directly hadn't worked. Every argument only seemed to push her further into rebellion. He needed something drastic, something that would sever her ties to that world of shallow glamour and parties. And then, as if the solution had been sitting quietly in the back of his mind all along, it came to him. Michael. Charles's eyes narrowed as the idea formed. Michael Dalton, the groundskeeper, had been with the family for over a decade. He was hardworking, dependable, and most importantly, he had no illusions about the life of luxury that had turned Eliza's head. Michael was everything Julian wasn't: grounded, honest, and someone who knew how to live within his means. Charles stood up, the plan solidifying with each step he took toward his office door. He wasn't just going to confront Eliza. No, he was going to make sure she saw what real life was, away from the superficial glitter of the city. The more he thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. Within minutes, Charles was on the phone with Michael, his tone as clipped and commanding as ever. "Come to the house. We need to talk." Michael walked up the steps to the grand house, a sense of unease settling in his chest. The urgency in Charles's voice had been unsettling, and when Charles Montgomery called, you didn't say no. He'd worked on the estate long enough to know that when Charles had a plan, you were expected to follow it. Michael didn't mind hard work, it was the way he'd built his life, but there was something about the way the request had come through that made him uneasy. He knocked lightly before stepping inside. The housekeeper nodded him toward the office, her usual smile absent. Something was definitely off. Charles stood behind his desk when Michael entered, motioning for him to sit without the usual pleasantries. Michael obliged, though his instincts told him to keep his guard up. "I'll get straight to the point," Charles began, his tone brooking no argument. "Eliza's making bad decisions. She's heading down a dangerous path, and I can't sit by and let her throw her future away." Michael shifted in his seat but didn't speak. He'd heard whispers about Eliza's relationship with some city boy, but it wasn't his place to pry. He was here to work on the property, not to mind the Montgomery family drama. Charles's gaze darkened. "I need her to understand the value of hard work, of real life, not this fantasy she's living in. And I need you to help me do that." Michael blinked, unsure of where this was going. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm not sure what." "I want her to marry you," Charles cut in, his voice flat, like he'd just proposed a business deal. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Michael sat back, stunned. "What? I don't understand." Charles leaned forward, hands braced on the desk, eyes sharp. "It's simple. You're the type of man who knows what it means to work for what you have. She needs that lesson. And I need you to teach it to her." "Sir, with all due respect, Eliza doesn't even like me." "This doesn't make sense," Michael said, his voice measured, though his pulse raced. This was beyond anything he could have imagined. It's not about like, Charles said coldly. It's about responsibility. She'll never listen to me as long as she's wrapped up in that world, so I'm taking control of the situation. The wedding will be in 2 days. Michael stood, his heart pounding. You can't be serious. You want me to marry your daughter to teach her a lesson? Charles crossed his arms, his expression unyielding. Yes, and you'll be compensated for your trouble. You won't have to worry about anything. I'll make sure of that. Michael shook his head, his mind spinning. This wasn't a favor, this was a command. He wanted to argue, to tell Charles this was insane, but he knew the man well enough to understand that there was no room for discussion. It was like he was adding another job to his role in the property. The decision had already been made. If he said no, he would lose his job and probably not find work anymore, because Charles would make sure of that, and he had seen it happen before. So, sure that the daughter would not let that happen, he simply nodded lightly. Later that evening, Eliza strolled into the house, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. She tossed her bag onto the marble floor, ready for one of her father's usual lectures. But the look on Charles's face when she stepped into the drawing room stopped her in her tracks. Eliza, he called, his voice carrying an edge that made her stomach tighten. What is it now? She groaned, crossing her arms. I'm not in the mood for another lecture, Dad. There won't be any more lectures, Charles said calmly, standing tall. You've made your choices, and now, you'll face the consequences. Eliza frowned. What are you talking about? You're getting married, Charles said, his voice as firm as stone. The words hung in the air for a long, shocked moment. What? Eliza's eyes widened in disbelief. To who? To Michael, the groundskeeper, Charles replied. Her world spun. You can't be serious, she sputtered, fury igniting in her chest. I'm very serious, Charles replied. The wedding is in 2 days, and that's final. As the realization sank in, Eliza's pulse raced. Her father was no longer just lecturing, he was taking control in the most brutal way possible. Eliza sat at her vanity, staring blankly at her reflection. The light from the large window bathed the room in a soft glow, but she could hardly notice. Her mind was buzzing with disbelief. 2 days. That was all it took for her father to dismantle every ounce of freedom she had left. 2 days to turn her life upside down. The white dress that hung beside her was simple, far from the grand designer gown she had once imagined herself wearing for her wedding day. This wasn't supposed to happen, not like this. Not in a rushed ceremony, with a man she barely knew, and certainly not as a punishment. Charles had been eerily calm about the entire thing, as though this was simply another business transaction he could manipulate into place. He had been clear, this wasn't about what she wanted. It was about teaching her a lesson, and Michael was the tool he had chosen to enforce it. The realization made her stomach turn. Her phone buzzed with another message from Julian, her Playboy ex. The screen lit up with his name, but Eliza ignored it. For the first time in weeks, the thought of Julian didn't ignite the usual excitement. Instead, it left her feeling empty. He had texted when he found out about the wedding, flirtatious, as if it were all some kind of joke. None of this was a joke. She knew that now. The door creaked open behind her, and the wedding planner, hired hastily by Charles, entered the room. It's time, she said gently, her voice filled with a sympathy Eliza didn't want. Eliza clenched her jaw and stood up, smoothing down the simple white dress. No veil, no flowers, no guests, just a few witnesses and the unshakable weight of her father's will hanging over her. She hated it. Every second of it. Michael stood outside in the garden, hands folded stiffly in front of him. He was dressed in a modest black suit that made him look far more formal than he felt. The quiet garden space, usually his place of peace, now felt suffocating. Flowers bloomed in orderly rows along the path, but their beauty did nothing to soothe the discomfort crawling up his spine. This wasn't his world. The suit, the vows he was about to take, it was all foreign to him. He had spent years keeping his head down, working the land. This was not the life he had imagined, and certainly not how he thought he'd marry, if he ever did. Yet here he was, standing on the edge of something that felt too big, too permanent. He had seen Eliza only a handful of times since the announcement, and each time, her eyes had burned with fury. She made it clear, without saying a word, that this wasn't what she wanted. But what choice did either of them have? Michael looked up as the door to the house opened, and Charles emerged, followed closely by Eliza. She walked with stiff, angry determination, her chin tilted high, a clear sign she was fighting to maintain her composure. The simple white dress clung to her like a symbol of defeat, but her fiery gaze told him she wasn't surrendering without a fight. Charles gave him a curt nod, then took his seat, as if he were a spectator in some cold performance. Michael's stomach tightened. This wasn't right. None of it. Eliza stopped in front of him, her hands clenched at her sides. She didn't look at him, not really. Her eyes stayed fixed on the officiant, and when he began the brief ceremony, Michael could practically feel the waves of anger radiating off her. The words felt heavy in the air. Each sentence dragged, like time was moving too slow and too fast all at once. The officiant spoke about commitment, loyalty, and partnership, but it all felt hollow. No one here believed in those words. Certainly not Eliza. When it came time for the vows, Michael hesitated. He glanced at Eliza, who stood rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. He spoke his part quietly, the words foreign on his tongue. He had never been good with speeches, and this one felt particularly wrong. "I do," he said, his voice steady but lacking the warmth a wedding should have. Then it was Eliza's turn. The silence that followed was palpable. She paused, a defiant glint in her eye as if she were daring someone to stop her. But there was no escape, not here. "I do," she whispered, the words barely audible. And just like that, it was done. Eliza Montgomery was now Eliza Dalton. The weight of those words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been a pawn in her father's twisted game, and now, legally bound to Michael, she felt trapped in a way she had never imagined possible. The officiant smiled warmly, though there was a hint of pity in her eyes as she concluded the ceremony. "You may now kiss the bride." Michael hesitated, and for a moment, they both stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Then, as if realizing the absurdity of it all, he gave a small, respectful nod and turned toward her. It wasn't a kiss born of passion or love, it was more like a formality, an awkward touch of lips that lingered just long enough to be called a kiss. Eliza turned away as soon as it was over, her face set like stone, her eyes brimming with unspoken fury. Michael knew then that whatever this was, it was far from over. Later that night, Eliza sat on the edge of the bed in the small guest house that had been designated as their new home. The room felt foreign, like a cage designed to remind her of her father's control. The walls were bare, the furniture modest. Everything about the place felt like a punishment. Michael sat quietly across the room, giving her space, as if sensing the storm brewing inside her. He wasn't the enemy, she knew that. But he was still part of this, part of the nightmare her father had orchestrated. "I'm not staying here," she said suddenly, her voice low and fierce. "I don't care what my father says. I'll find a way out." Michael looked at her, his face unreadable. He didn't argue, didn't try to change her mind. He only nodded slightly, as if understanding that whatever came next was her battle to fight. Eliza clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. She would not be her father's puppet. Not anymore. And no matter how impossible it seemed, she would find a way to break free from this marriage, from this life, and from everything Charles Montgomery had planned for her. The guest house was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Eliza sat by the window, staring at the vast stretch of land that now felt like her personal prison. The Montgomery estate had always been her playground, a place where she could bask in her father's wealth and influence. Now, it was a cage, and the guest house at its edge was the epitome of everything she resented. She hadn't spoken much to Michael since the wedding. They had exchanged a few polite words, mainly logistical, the kind of conversations one has with a distant colleague. Michael, for his part, seemed perfectly fine with the silence. He moved about their new shared space with an air of quiet competence, never pressing her to engage or forcing her into uncomfortable conversations. For that, Eliza was grateful. She couldn't deal with more than she was already grappling with. Her father's betrayal still burned in her chest, and the knowledge that she was stuck here, living a life she hadn't chosen, with a man she didn't want, was like a weight pressing down on her lungs. The guest house itself was modest but not unpleasant. 2 small bedrooms, a living room with a threadbare sofa, a functional kitchen. It was clean, simple, and nothing like the luxury she had grown up with. She hated it. Michael had already settled into his routines, spending most of his time outside working. If he wasn't in the garden or walking the perimeter of the estate, he was in the small shed at the back of the guest house, fixing whatever needed fixing. He never asked Eliza to help, and that suited her just fine. She had no interest in playing house or pretending this was a normal life. The silence between them was heavy but unspoken, an unspoken agreement that neither would intrude on the other. Eliza would spend her days plotting how to escape, how to get her old life back. She'd ignored the calls from Julian, uncertain if running back to him was the right answer. But she had to do something. This couldn't be her future. Michael wiped the sweat from his brow as he stood from the flower bed he'd been tending. The garden around the guest house needed more attention than he had expected, and he found himself focusing on it with a single-minded determination. It wasn't just the plants he was tending, though. It was a distraction, a way to keep himself from thinking too much about Eliza or their awkward living situation. She wasn't cruel to him, but she wasn't exactly friendly either. The cold distance she kept between them was like a wall he had no interest in breaking down. He understood her anger. She hadn't wanted this marriage any more than he had, but there was nothing he could do about it. Charles had made the decision, and now they were stuck with it. Michael didn't mind the quiet. He had always been the kind of man who found peace in his work, who didn't need to fill the air with needless words. He had grown up learning that some things in life required patience, that not everything needed to be solved immediately. And patience was something he was good at. Still, there were moments, brief and fleeting, where he wondered if Eliza would ever soften toward him, if she would ever see him as anything other than a punishment. Those thoughts were quickly pushed aside. It didn't matter how she saw him. This wasn't about romance or affection. This was about survival, both of them getting through this ridiculous situation intact. As he knelt down to pull another weed, he caught a glimpse of her through the window. She was sitting by the kitchen table, her fingers drumming on the wood as she stared out toward the estate. Michael couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. She was clearly out of her element here, but she hadn't complained openly, not to him at least. He stood and dusted off his hands, deciding to leave her in peace. She was clearly plotting something. He could see it in the way she would tense up every time her phone buzzed with a message. Michael had his suspicions about who was on the other end of those texts, but it wasn't his place to ask. If she was planning to run off, that was her choice. He wasn't going to stop her. He picked up his tools and headed toward the shed, making a mental note of the repairs still needed on the roof of the guest house. Keeping his hands busy was the best way to avoid dwelling on the strange twist his life had taken. Eliza watched him as he moved toward the shed, his broad shoulders disappearing into the small building at the edge of the garden. He was always working, always moving with quiet purpose. It irritated her how calm he seemed, how unaffected he appeared by the absurdity of their situation. How could he be so accepting of all this? Did he really not care that his life had been upended, too? She wanted to ask him, to yell at him even, but that would mean acknowledging him. Acknowledging this marriage. And she wasn't ready to do that. She turned back to her phone, scanning the messages from Julian. He was still trying to coax her back to the city, to the life they had once shared. His words were filled with promises of parties, expensive gifts, and the freedom to do whatever they wanted. But there was something hollow in those promises now. She wasn't sure why they didn't hold the same allure anymore. No, she wasn't staying here. But the more she thought about it, the less she wanted to return to Julian's world either. She had spent years running in those circles, and where had it gotten her? Trapped in a marriage she couldn't escape and cut off from her father's money. For now, though, she had to stay. At least until she figured out a real plan. Leaving impulsively would only leave her broke and dependent on someone else, someone like Julian. And she wasn't about to trade one cage for another. With a sigh, she stood up and stretched, pacing around the small kitchen to release some of her frustration. There had to be a way out. She just had to find it. The next few days passed much the same. The tension between Eliza and Michael lingered like a low-hanging cloud, ever present but never addressed. They lived in separate worlds, despite sharing the same small space. Michael kept himself busy with the garden, the estate, and whatever needed fixing. Eliza spent her time in quiet contemplation, her mind spinning with ways to regain her freedom. Neither of them knew how long they could keep it up, but for now, it was a truce, an uneasy one, but a truce nonetheless. The idea of running away had been simmering in Eliza's mind for days, building with every silent dinner, every glance at Michael as he worked on the garden, every time she looked at her phone and saw Julian's messages. She was suffocating here, in this small guest house, trapped in a life that wasn't hers. Charles had made sure of that. But no more. Tonight, she'd be gone. She packed quietly, making sure the old suitcase didn't make any noise as she folded clothes into it. Jeans, a few dresses, and the essentials she couldn't live without. Her designer bags, the shoes she'd once collected like trophies, all stayed behind. There wasn't room for that kind of vanity in her escape plan. Eliza paused for a moment, glancing around the guest house, and felt the familiar knot of anger twist inside her. She didn't belong here. Michael had already gone to bed, his door closed, and the soft hum of the evening filling the quiet house. She doubted he'd stop her even if he knew she was leaving. It wasn't like he had any reason to care. He'd been as neutral as ever since the wedding, keeping his distance, letting her stew in her resentment. He wouldn't come after her, and she certainly wouldn't wait around to see if he did. Satisfied she had everything she needed, she zipped up the suitcase and headed for the door, pausing only to grab her phone and check the messages one last time. Julian had sent a text just an hour ago, urging her to come back to the city. It was like he could sense her restlessness, the need to break free from this place. He had promised her a night out at the hottest club, drinks on him, and the kind of freedom she'd been craving since this nightmare had begun. Her hand tightened on the phone as she pulled open the door, stepping into the cool night air. The garden was quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. She hesitated for just a moment, wondering if this was really the right choice. But then she pushed the thought away. Anything was better than this. She wasn't meant for small-town life, for a guest house on the edge of her father's estate. She was meant for something bigger, brighter. Eliza headed for the gate, her steps quick and determined, the soft click of her suitcase wheels on the gravel path the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. Once she reached the main road, she pulled out her phone again, ordering a rideshare to the nearest city. From there, she'd catch a train back to the life she knew. The city lights greeted her with a familiar buzz, neon signs flashing, the hum of nightlife thrumming in the air. Eliza stepped out of the train station, suitcase in hand, feeling a surge of relief as she blended into the late-night crowd. This was her world, the glamour, the people, the pulse of excitement. The estate had always felt like a cage, but here, she could breathe. Her first stop was Julian's penthouse. He had sent the address earlier, telling her she could crash there until she figured things out. But when she arrived, knocking on the sleek black door, it wasn't Julian who answered. It was one of his friends, barely looking up from his phone as he told her Julian had gone out with someone else and wouldn't be back for the night. Eliza stood there, her suitcase heavy in her hand, a knot forming in her chest. She had assumed Julian would be waiting, eager to see her. Instead, she was greeted with indifference. It stung more than she'd expected. Swallowing her disappointment, she left and checked into a nearby hotel with the last of her cash, telling herself it didn't matter. Tomorrow, she'd figure things out. Tomorrow, she'd be back on track. The next morning, reality hit harder than she'd anticipated. After a restless night, Eliza woke up to messages from her father's office. Her accounts had been frozen. Every one of them. Charles's control reached further than she'd realized. No more credit cards, no access to her trust fund. Nothing. She scrolled through her contacts, calling a few friends, expecting sympathy, maybe a place to crash while she sorted things out. But each conversation ended with the same awkward silences, the same hollow apologies. Her friends, the ones who had always been there for the parties, the shopping trips, the glamorous nights out, they were suddenly too busy, too distant. The hollow realization set in. Without her father's wealth behind her, she was no longer the center of attention. No longer a part of their world. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring out at the city skyline. The life she had come running back to wasn't hers anymore. The people she thought were her friends had abandoned her at the first sign of trouble. Julian, the man she had been so eager to return to, was more interested in his next conquest than in her. The anger she had carried toward her father, toward Michael, now twisted into something deeper. She had been dependent on her father's wealth for everything, her life, her status, her identity. And now, without it, she was lost. Eliza ran a hand through her hair, standing up and pacing the small hotel room. What was she supposed to do now? She had no money, no plan, and no one to turn to. Running had seemed like the best option, the only option. But now she saw it for what it was, an escape from one prison into another. The weight of the realization settled over her like a blanket. Her old life wasn't waiting for her. It had moved on without her. And now, she had to figure out who she was without it. As the day turned into evening, Eliza found herself back at the train station, her suitcase in tow once again. She had nowhere else to go. The city that had once felt like her world now felt foreign, distant. She thought about calling her father, about begging him to take her back, to unfreeze her accounts, to give her her old life. But she knew better. Charles would see this as a lesson, one she was supposed to learn. And maybe she was starting to. When the train pulled into the station, Eliza boarded, settling into the corner of the carriage with a heavy sigh. She didn't know what she was going back to, but she knew it wasn't the life she had imagined. By the time she reached the estate, the night had fallen again, and the guest house was dark. Eliza stood for a moment at the edge of the garden, her suitcase beside her, the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. Michael's truck was parked outside, a faint glow coming from the small shed where he spent most of his time. She hadn't expected a warm welcome, and when she pushed open the door to the guest house, she wasn't surprised to find the place exactly as she had left it, quiet, still, empty. The grand estate loomed in front of Eliza as she made her way up the path toward the main house. The sight of it, once so familiar and comforting, now filled her with a sour mix of anger and resentment. She had thought leaving would be her answer, that escaping back to the life she knew would fix everything. But it hadn't. It only made her realize how deeply her father's grip extended, how little of her life had been truly her own. Her fingers clenched around the strap of her bag as she approached the front door. The air felt heavy, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. Every step she took felt like a battle, her mind racing with everything she wanted to say. She had returned defeated, but that didn't mean she'd given up. Charles owed her an explanation, and this time, she wasn't leaving until she had won. The door was open, as it always was for her. No need to knock. She stepped inside, the cool air of the foyer a stark contrast to the tension building inside her. The house was as grand as ever, but now, it felt cold, distant, like every inch of it was designed to remind her that this was Charles's world. And she had never truly belonged in it. Maria, the family's longtime housekeeper, appeared from a side hallway, her warm, lined face softening at the sight of Eliza. "Miss Eliza," she said gently, "your father's in his office. I can let him know." "No need," Eliza interrupted, her voice tight. "I'll handle it." Maria nodded, her eyes filled with quiet understanding, and stepped aside. Eliza could feel the older woman's gaze following her as she strode down the hallway toward the office. It had always been Charles's command center, the place where he made his deals, built his empire, and controlled everything, and everyone, around him. Without pausing to knock, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. Charles was at his desk, his back to her, staring out the wide window that overlooked the estate's rolling vineyards. His posture was as rigid as always, a man forever in control of his domain. "Eliza," he said without turning around, as if he'd sensed her presence the moment she walked in. "I was wondering when you'd come back." The words set her teeth on edge. He wasn't surprised to see her. He wasn't concerned about where she had been or what she had gone through. He was waiting, like a predator certain its prey would eventually return. "Cut the act, Dad," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm not here for pleasantries. I'm here to talk about this farce you've trapped me in." Charles turned his chair slowly, his gaze cold and unwavering as he met her eyes. "Farce? Is that what you're calling it now?" "I'd call it a lesson, one you desperately needed to learn." Her fists clenched at her sides. "This isn't a lesson. It's control. You've manipulated every aspect of my life. I'm not a puppet for you to play with." Charles stood, moving around the desk with the slow precision of a man who knew his power, who never rushed for anyone. He crossed his arms, leaning casually against the desk as if they were discussing business, not her entire future. "And yet, you ran. Just like I knew you would. And you came back, because, Eliza, you haven't learned how to live without me." Eliza bristled, stepping forward, her voice rising. "You froze my accounts, Dad. You left me with nothing. Of course I came back. What was I supposed to do, beg on the streets?" Charles's eyes flashed with a hint of cold amusement. "It's called responsibility, Eliza. Something you've never had to deal with before. Running off to the city, thinking Julian or some party would save you. That's what you've always done. And I won't stand by and let you destroy yourself because you don't understand what real life is. You don't get to decide what my life should be," she shouted, her breath coming faster now, the frustration finally bubbling to the surface. "You don't get to throw me into a marriage I didn't ask for and pretend it's for my own good. I'm not a child anymore." Charles's expression darkened, the faint trace of a smile gone. He straightened, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. "You are still my daughter, and you are still under my protection. You've proven, again, that you can't handle the responsibility that comes with the life you've had. And until you do, I will make the decisions for you." Eliza felt the weight of his words like a slap in the face. He had never seen her as an adult, never seen her as capable of making her own choices. In his eyes, she would always be the reckless girl, always dependent on him, his wealth, and his control. "So, that's it?" she asked, her voice quieter now but no less fierce. I'm just supposed to play house with Michael because you think it'll teach me to be responsible. Charles's jaw tightened, but his eyes remained cold. You'll stay married to Michael because I've made my decision. And you will learn what it means to live without indulgence. Eliza stared at him, her chest tight with frustration and a sharp sense of betrayal. She had come here hoping for some way out, some chance to regain control of her life. But Charles had never been the kind of man to give second chances, and he wasn't about to start now. This isn't about me learning anything, she said, shaking her head. This is about you keeping control, about making sure I never become something you can't manage. Charles didn't deny it. He only watched her with the calm assurance of a man who had never once questioned his own power. Eliza took a breath, steeling herself. I want an annulment, she demanded, forcing the words out before she could second-guess herself. This marriage is a sham, and I want out. Charles raised an eyebrow, almost bored by the suggestion. No. The word landed with a finality that drained the air from the room. No. Eliza echoed, her voice breaking slightly. Just like that? Charles's gaze was cold as ice. Just like that. She stood there for a moment, the weight of his control suffocating her, every avenue of escape closing in. She was trapped again, and Charles knew it. But this time, something shifted inside her, a flicker of defiance she hadn't felt before. Fine, she said through gritted teeth, her voice low but steady. But don't think for a second that I'm just going to play along with your plan. I'll figure this out. And when I do, you won't be able to control me anymore. Charles's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, in his eyes. We'll see, won't we? Without another word, Eliza turned and stormed out of the office, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. She didn't look back. Back in the guest house, Eliza sat at the small kitchen table, staring out the window at the darkening sky. She felt raw, furious, but more than anything, she felt determined. She had tried running, and it hadn't worked. Now, she would have to fight from the inside. If her father wanted to control her, he would have to work harder than ever before. Eliza's return to the guest house felt heavier than when she had first left it. The simple, quiet rooms now felt like the backdrop to a war, not just between her and her father, but one that had started within herself. She was still reeling from the confrontation, Charles's cold dismissal of her desire for freedom playing on repeat in her mind. Michael had just come in from the garden when she walked through the door. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable, but Eliza could sense he knew something had shifted. She didn't speak as she brushed past him, heading straight for the small bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Michael stayed still for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of her pacing on the other side of the door. It wasn't his place to ask, but he knew from the look on her face that she hadn't gotten what she wanted from Charles. The tension between father and daughter had always been palpable, but this felt different. It felt like a final break. He returned to the small kitchen and set about making tea, his hands working automatically, knowing that whatever anger she carried, it wasn't something he could fix. He could only wait, and give her space to come to her own conclusions. That's how it had always been since the wedding. He respected her space, kept his distance, and let her figure things out on her own terms. He heard the door creak open behind him. Eliza stepped into the kitchen, her face flushed but composed, a quiet resolve simmering under the surface of her usual frustration. Michael placed the kettle on the stove, glancing at her briefly, but he didn't say a word. I spoke to him, Eliza said finally, leaning against the counter. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, as if physically holding herself together. Michael nodded but waited, sensing she wasn't finished. I asked for an annulment, she continued, her voice harder than usual. He said no. Michael frowned but didn't comment, though he wasn't surprised. Charles Montgomery wasn't a man known for his flexibility. Eliza sighed and dropped her arms, looking away as though the weight of it all was pulling her down. I thought running away would fix this. That if I left, I could start over, but it didn't work, she admitted, her tone a mix of anger and exhaustion. He's never going to let me go. He's never going to stop trying to control me. Michael leaned back against the counter across from her, his arms folded loosely. So, what now? Eliza looked up at him, her expression shifting from defeat to determination. Now, I fight back. Michael raised an eyebrow, surprised at the intensity in her voice. This was different from the Eliza he had been living with these past few weeks, the woman who had barely tolerated his presence, who had distanced herself from everything. Now, she seemed ready to take on the world. I'm not going to let him win, Michael, she said, pushing away from the counter. He thinks I can't survive without his money, without his approval. But I can. I'll figure it out. Michael could see the fire in her eyes. She wasn't bluffing. For the first time, she looked like she had a plan, like she was ready to face whatever came next without running. He wasn't sure what had changed in her, but whatever it was, he could respect it. If you're serious about that, he said, his voice low but steady, then you'll need to stop thinking of this as temporary. She narrowed her eyes at him, suspicion creeping in. What do you mean? I mean, Michael continued, choosing his words carefully, you've been living here like you're just waiting to leave, like this place doesn't matter. But if you're going to stand up to him, you can't keep acting like you're not part of this anymore. Eliza frowned, the words sinking in deeper than she wanted to admit. He was right. She had treated the guest house, the estate, even Michael himself, like none of it mattered, like it was all just a blip in her life. But that hadn't worked. Maybe it was time to start seeing things differently. She crossed her arms again, but this time it wasn't out of anger. So, what do you suggest? Michael gave a small shrug. Start by taking control of the things you can. Work with what's here. You may not be able to change Charles overnight, but you can start changing how you handle the situation. Eliza stared at him for a moment, processing his words. It wasn't exactly the kind of advice she had expected, but there was a truth in it she couldn't ignore. The old Eliza would have scoffed, would have brushed it off as beneath her. But standing in the aftermath of her failed escape, she realized she didn't have the luxury of pride anymore. What, like start helping in the garden, she said, her voice tinged with sarcasm, but without the usual bite. Michael smirked, shaking his head. You don't have to start with the garden, but it wouldn't hurt. Eliza rolled her eyes, but there was a flicker of something close to amusement in her expression. I'll think about it, she muttered, but the words didn't sound like a lie. The next morning, Eliza woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. The sun filtered through the thin curtains, casting soft shadows across the small room. She lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, her mind drifting back to the conversation with Michael. She didn't want to admit it, but he had a point. Maybe if she stopped seeing everything as a temporary punishment, she could find a way to gain control, not just of her situation, but of her life. Charles had always been the one pulling the strings, but if she could make this life her own, even in the smallest ways, then maybe she could finally free herself from his grip. Pulling herself out of bed, she threw on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, tying her hair up into a quick ponytail. The air outside was cool, the morning dew still clinging to the grass as she stepped out of the guest house. Michael was already in the garden, kneeling in the soil, methodically planting rows of new flowers. He glanced up as she approached, his expression neutral but curious. Need any help? Eliza asked, her voice casual but with a hint of uncertainty. Michael stood, dusting off his hands, his eyes studying her for a moment before he nodded. Yeah, I could use some help. He handed her a small trowel, and together they began working side by side. The silence between them wasn't tense like it used to be. It was a different kind of quiet, one that spoke of understanding, of the first step towards something neither of them had expected. As Eliza knelt in the dirt, feeling the earth between her fingers, she realized that maybe Michael was right. Maybe she didn't need to run. Maybe the fight she had been looking for wasn't about escaping, it was about reclaiming herself. The sun was just starting to rise over the vineyard when the first phone call came in. Eliza had been sitting at the small table in the kitchen, sipping her coffee and thinking about the day ahead. She'd spent the last week slowly integrating herself into the estate's workings, small things at first, like learning about the vineyard operations, going over old financial reports, and even helping Michael in the garden. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but there was something satisfying about taking ownership, even if it was in small ways. But the call shattered the peaceful morning, and by the time Eliza answered, she could tell something was wrong from the tight voice on the other end. "Eliza, it's Gerald, the estate's attorney," the voice crackled. "We've got a problem." She sat up straighter, heart pounding. "What's going on?" "There's a boundary dispute with the property next to yours," he explained, frustration clear in his tone. "The new owner is claiming part of the vineyard land belongs to them. They're threatening legal action unless we agree to pay them for it, which could cost millions. I've tried to reach your father, but he's unreachable on business. You're going to have to handle this." Eliza's stomach dropped. A lawsuit? She wasn't prepared for this. Her father had always been the one to deal with the high-stakes business decisions, but now, he was gone, and she was left holding the reins. I'll deal with it," she said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. She had no idea what she was doing, but the last thing she wanted was to let this spiral out of control. Hanging up the phone, Eliza sat still for a moment, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. This wasn't just about keeping up appearances or making small improvements around the estate. This was real, and it could have serious financial consequences if handled poorly. She glanced out the window and spotted Michael already at work in the garden. Without hesitating, she grabbed her jacket and headed outside, her mind racing. Michael looked up as she approached, wiping the sweat from his brow. He could tell from her expression that something was wrong. "Michael, we've got a problem," she said, breathless with urgency. "There's a boundary dispute with the neighboring property, and they're threatening legal action. They're claiming part of the vineyard is theirs, and they want millions." Michael frowned, straightening. "That land's been in the Montgomery family for decades. I don't see how they can make a claim now." "I don't either, but we need to do something," she replied, panic creeping into her voice. "My father isn't here to handle it, and if we don't act fast, this could blow up in our faces." Michael paused for a moment, thinking. He could see the worry etched on her face, but there was also something different this time, an edge of determination that hadn't been there before. "We need to gather all the records on that land," Michael said. "There should be old property surveys, maybe even contracts from when your father bought out the last boundary agreement years ago. If we can prove the vineyard has been Montgomery property all this time, we'll have a strong case." Eliza nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. "Okay. Let's do it. Where do we start?" Michael led her to the main house, to a room she hadn't spent much time in, the estate's archive, filled with dusty records and boxes. It was a far cry from the glamorous life she'd once known, but today, none of that mattered. She rolled up her sleeves and joined Michael in the search, sorting through old documents, maps, and contracts. Hours passed, and the weight of their task pressed heavier with each minute. The records were extensive, but some were incomplete or outdated. The further back they went, the murkier the details became. Eliza brushed a strand of hair from her face, the frustration mounting. "What if we don't find anything useful? We can't just pay millions to settle this." Michael didn't look up from the map he was studying. "We'll find something," he said with quiet confidence. "There's always a way." Eliza paused for a moment, watching him work. It struck her how steady he was, even in the face of a crisis. She had been used to dealing with people who cracked under pressure or who threw money at problems to make them go away. But Michael was different. He was calm, deliberate, and focused on the solution. Finally, after hours of searching, Michael's voice broke through the silence. "Here," he said, holding up an old survey map. "This is from 30 years ago, when your father settled a boundary dispute with the previous owner. It shows the exact measurements of the property line, and if I'm reading this right, it includes the land the neighbors are claiming." Eliza leaned over to look at the map, her eyes scanning the lines and measurements. Relief flooded through her. "This proves it, right? That land is ours." Michael nodded. "It's strong evidence. We can take this to the attorney and let them handle the legal side. But it's not just about proving we own it, it's about showing them we won't back down." For the first time since the phone call, Eliza felt a surge of confidence. They had something solid to fight with. And more than that, she realized that she wasn't doing this alone. Michael had been there, guiding her, working alongside her. They were a team, and it was the first time in weeks that she felt like she had someone she could rely on. The next day, they met with the attorney, laying out the documents and maps in front of him. Gerald scanned the paperwork, nodding slowly as he read through the details. "This is good," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "Very good. This will give us leverage in court, if it comes to that. I'll contact their lawyer and make it clear that we're prepared to defend this land." Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The crisis wasn't over, but they had taken control of it. For the first time, she felt like she had a grasp on the estate's operations, and on her own capabilities. Back at the guest house, as the sun began to set over the vineyard, Eliza and Michael sat on the porch, the cool breeze a welcome relief after the long, stressful day. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them felt different, less like strangers, more like partners. "Thanks for helping with this," Eliza said finally, breaking the quiet. "I don't think I could have handled it without you." Michael glanced over at her, his expression softening. "You handled it just fine. You're more capable than you think, Eliza." She smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the helpless girl Charles always painted her to be. She had faced a crisis head-on and had worked with Michael to find a solution. And somehow, that felt more empowering than anything she had ever known. The vineyard was bathed in a golden glow as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the rows of grapevines. Eliza stood at the edge of the garden, her hands dirty from an afternoon of working with Michael. It had become part of her new routine, something grounding in the midst of the chaos that had defined her life for so long. She was finally starting to feel a sense of stability, however fragile it might be. The estate no longer felt like a prison but a place where she could begin to rebuild, even if the future still felt uncertain. Michael had been a steady presence, and working alongside him had shifted something inside her. For the first time, she was starting to see the possibility of a life beyond the one she had left behind. But then the familiar roar of a sports car shattered the quiet. Eliza's heart sank as she turned toward the driveway, recognizing the sleek black Ferrari pulling up in front of the house. Julian. He stepped out, dressed impeccably as always, his dark sunglasses glinting in the fading light. His smile was as charming as ever, but something about the way he stood there, leaning casually against his car, set her on edge. "What the hell is he doing here?" Michael's voice was low, but Eliza could hear the sharp edge in it. He had walked up beside her, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Julian with a mixture of wariness and irritation. Eliza swallowed hard, a familiar mix of emotions swirling inside her. Anger. Confusion. And, despite everything, a sliver of temptation. Julian had always had that effect on her. He made the wild, glamorous life she once knew seem irresistible. And now, here he was, standing on the doorstep of the world she was trying to navigate. I'll handle this, she said, more to herself than to Michael, and before she could second-guess herself, she walked toward Julian. Well. If it isn't my runaway bride, Julian drawled, pushing his sunglasses up onto his head. His smile widened as Eliza approached, and he held out his arms like he was expecting her to fall into them. Miss me, darling? Julian, Eliza said, her tone flat, trying to mask the mix of emotions roiling inside her. What are you doing here? He shrugged, his casual nonchalance grating against her nerves. I heard you were back at the estate. Thought I'd come to rescue you from this quaint little life you found yourself in. He glanced over her shoulder toward Michael, giving a smug nod as if dismissing him altogether. Eliza resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Of course, he thought she needed rescuing. Julian had always viewed her life through the lens of wealth, luxury, and indulgence. The idea that she might be learning something from living differently was probably beyond his comprehension. Why are you really here? She asked, crossing her arms and staring him down. You didn't just drive all the way out here to be nice. He chuckled, stepping closer, his voice dropping into that smooth, persuasive tone he'd used so many times before. Come on, Eliza. You don't belong here. This place? He gestured around, clearly unimpressed by the estate that had been in her family for generations. This isn't you. The parties, the fun, the freedom, that's you. Remember what we had? You were the queen of the city, and everyone adored you. You can have all of that again. We can have it all. For a brief moment, his words tugged at something deep inside her. She remembered the nights of champagne and rooftop parties, the whirlwind of attention and excitement. There had been a time when that life had felt like everything, when she had reveled in the power it gave her. But that life had also been hollow, and running back to it now felt like retreating into an illusion. She shook her head, taking a step back. Julian, I'm not that girl anymore. His smile faltered, just slightly. Not that girl? Eliza, don't kid yourself. You're not cut out for this. He waved his hand dismissively toward the vineyard. Whatever this is. Come back with me. We'll hit the city tonight, just like old times. You don't need to be stuck here, playing house. I'm not stuck, Eliza said, her voice firmer this time, though she could feel her resolve wavering under the weight of his words. I'm figuring things out. Julian's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing slightly as he sensed her hesitation. Figuring things out? You're wasting your time here, Eliza. You're not meant for this life of dirty hands and small towns. You're meant for something bigger, something better. Come on, baby, you know this isn't you. Before she could respond, Michael's voice cut through the tension, steady but firm. Maybe she's not interested in what you're offering anymore, Julian. Eliza turned, surprised by Michael's sudden approach. He stood a few feet away, his gaze locked on Julian, his jaw tight. There was no aggression in his stance, but his presence alone was enough to make the air crackle with unspoken tension. Julian raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed. Oh, you've got the gardener speaking for you now? His tone was mocking, dripping with condescension. That's cute. Michael didn't take the bait. Instead, he looked at Eliza, his voice calm but filled with meaning. You don't need him, Eliza. You already know what his world is like, and you know exactly what kind of life you'd be going back to. Nothing about it has changed. He just wants to pull you back into that mess. Eliza's chest tightened as she looked between the two men. Julian, with his perfect smile and promises of luxury, represented everything she had once craved. And Michael, with his quiet strength and steady presence, represented the world she was starting to build for herself, a world where she could finally take control of her own life, on her own terms. Julian took a step closer, lowering his voice in that conspiratorial way that used to make her heart race. Come on, Eliza. We were good together. You know you want this. All you have to do is say the word, and I'll get you out of here. But the pull wasn't as strong as it had once been. The allure of Julian's world, the one that had once seemed so glamorous and intoxicating, now felt empty. It was the same shallow promises, the same hollow excitement. And Eliza had changed. I'm not running away, she said softly, the decision settling in her chest with an unexpected certainty. Not anymore. Julian blinked, clearly caught off guard. He hadn't expected her to refuse. You're serious? Eliza nodded, her voice steadier now. I'm serious. For a moment, Julian just stood there, looking at her like she was someone he no longer recognized. Then, with a frustrated shake of his head, he gave a sarcastic laugh. Your loss, babe. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, slamming the door and peeling out of the driveway in a cloud of dust. Eliza stood there, her heart still racing, but a strange sense of relief washing over her. She had made a choice, not because of Michael or her father, but because she finally knew what she wanted. Michael stepped up beside her, watching the dust settle. You okay? Eliza looked over at him, the weight of the moment sinking in. She nodded. Yeah. I think I am. The quiet of the vineyard had never felt more peaceful, more grounding. The soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant hum of life moving forward, it was all so different from the chaos that used to define Eliza's world. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the rolling fields, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Eliza felt a sense of calm. A sense of certainty. Julian's visit had shaken something loose inside her, but not in the way he had expected. Instead of pulling her back into his world of superficial thrills, it had solidified what she already knew deep down: she didn't belong there anymore. The glittering city nights, the reckless indulgence, the constant need to chase something bigger, flashier, it all seemed hollow now. Julian hadn't come for her because he cared about her. He had come because he saw her as a way back to power, to status. He had never cared about Eliza as a person, just as a pawn in a game she no longer wanted to play. She had spent too long letting other people define her life, her choices, her worth. First, it was her father, then Julian. But here, in this quiet space she had once despised, she had started to learn something about herself. She was stronger than she'd ever realized, and the challenges she'd faced in the past few months had forced her to grow in ways she couldn't have imagined. Michael had been a part of that, but not because he tried to save her. He never did. Instead, he had simply been there, steady, patient, and real. He never treated her like she was fragile or incapable, and he had never tried to control her. Michael had shown her that life didn't have to be about proving something to the world, it could be about finding peace, about building something meaningful from the ground up. As the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, Eliza knew what she had to do. The next morning, Eliza made her way to the main house. Her heart raced with anticipation, but this time, it wasn't from fear or anxiety. It was from the knowledge that what she was about to do was entirely her choice. She wasn't going to let Charles dictate her future any longer. Charles was in his office, just as he always was, surrounded by papers and contracts, the empire he had built at his fingertips. He barely glanced up as she walked in, still engrossed in whatever deal he was working on. But when he did finally look at her, there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He wasn't used to Eliza walking in with purpose, at least not lately. Eliza, he said, leaning back in his chair. His voice was cool, measured, as always. What can I do for you? Eliza didn't waste any time. She stepped forward, her chin held high, and met his gaze without wavering. I'm here to tell you that I'm staying married to Michael. Charles raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by her boldness. Are you? His tone was dismissive, like he was humoring a child who didn't quite understand the gravity of her decisions. I am, Eliza said firmly, her voice steady. And I'm not doing it because you forced me into it. I'm doing it because I choose to. Charles's expression darkened, his patience thinning. Eliza, be reasonable. You're throwing away your future. This, whatever you think you're doing, isn't real. You don't belong here. Eliza took a deep breath, holding her ground. No, Dad. What's not real is the life you tried to force me back into. I see that now. I see Julian for what he really is, someone who never cared about me, only about what I could give him. And for a long time, I let that define me. I let you define me. Charles stood, his imposing figure casting a shadow across the room. You're making a mistake. You don't understand what you're giving up. But Eliza wasn't intimidated anymore. I'm not giving up anything, Dad. I'm finally choosing something for myself. I'm choosing a life that I can build, not one that's handed to me with conditions. I'm staying with Michael because I want to, not because you forced me. And nothing you say is going to change that. The room was silent for a long moment, the tension between them palpable. Charles stared at her, his jaw tight, his eyes cold with disappointment. He had always been able to control her, to bend her to his will. But not this time. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. You think you're doing the right thing, but you'll come crawling back. You're not cut out for this kind of life, Eliza. You'll regret it. Eliza shook her head, her voice calm but resolute. Maybe I will. But at least it'll be my decision. Not yours. Charles said nothing more, but the silence spoke volumes. He wasn't used to losing, and the fact that his daughter was standing in front of him, making her own choices, was clearly a blow to his control. But Eliza didn't wait for his approval. She didn't need it anymore. She turned and walked out of the office, her heart pounding in her chest, but a weight lifted off her shoulders. For the first time, she had stood up to her father and chosen her own path. And it felt good. Back at the guest house, Eliza found Michael working in the garden as usual. He glanced up when she approached, wiping his hands on his jeans, his expression curious but calm. You were with Charles, he said, more of an observation than a question. Eliza nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. Yeah. I told him I'm staying. With you. Michael's brow lifted in surprise. You told him? I did, she replied, the satisfaction clear in her voice. And I didn't do it because of him or anyone else. I did it because it's what I want. Michael watched her for a long moment, his eyes softening as he realized the weight of her words. He had never pressured her to stay, never tried to sway her one way or the other. He had simply been there, and that was what made the difference. Well, he said, his voice low and warm, I'm glad you're staying. Eliza stepped closer, the warmth of the moment settling between them. Me too. They stood there for a moment, the air between them filled with an unspoken understanding. There was still work to be done, challenges to face, but now it felt different. Now, Eliza felt like she wasn't just surviving, she was living. And this life, this partnership with Michael, was something she had chosen for herself. As they stood together, side by side in the vineyard that had become a symbol of her growth, Eliza knew that her life was finally hers. And for the first time, she felt free, free to build a future on her own terms, with someone who saw her for who she truly was. Not her father's daughter. Not a pawn in Julian's games. But Eliza. Strong, capable, and in control of her own destiny. The vineyard was quiet in the early morning light, the air fresh and cool as the sun began its slow ascent over the rolling hills. There was a softness to the world at this hour, a sense of peace that made everything feel possible. Today, it felt even more so. Today was a new beginning. Eliza stood in front of the small mirror in the guest house, adjusting the simple white dress she had chosen for the day. It wasn't grand or elaborate, not like the gown she had worn at her first wedding, the one that had felt like a cage, more a symbol of her father's control than her own life. This dress was different. It was hers. And today, this ceremony, this promise, would be hers, too. She smiled to herself as she slipped on the delicate necklace Michael had given her just a few days ago. It wasn't flashy or expensive, but it held more meaning than anything she'd ever owned. It was a quiet symbol of the life they had built together, a life that had come from struggle, from growth, from choosing each other not because they had to, but because they wanted to. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Michael stepped in, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection of the mirror. He was dressed in a simple, crisp white shirt and dark pants, his usual workwear exchanged for something a little more formal today, though he still looked like the Michael she had come to know, steady, grounded, real. "You ready?" he asked, his voice warm and calm, as always. Eliza turned to face him, her smile widening. "More than ready." He stepped closer, his hands sliding gently around her waist as they stood together in the quiet of the guest house. There was something unspoken between them, a sense of understanding that needed no words. This wasn't the grand wedding her father had envisioned for her months ago, but it was perfect because it was theirs. And that made all the difference. The ceremony was small, just as they had planned. A simple archway made of flowers Michael had gathered from the garden, with the vineyard stretching out behind them. The rows of grapevines, vibrant and full of life, felt like a reflection of everything they had been through together, the growth, the hard work, the moments of doubt, and the ultimate reward of something beautiful. A local officiant stood by the arch, smiling warmly as she waited for them to take their places. There were no guests, no extravagant decorations, no bustling crowd. It was just Eliza and Michael, standing side by side in the place they had come to call their own. As they exchanged vows, there was none of the awkwardness or resentment that had clouded their first wedding. There was only sincerity, an acknowledgement of the journey they had taken and the choice they were making to move forward together. Michael's voice was steady as he looked into Eliza's eyes. "Eliza, I never imagined we'd end up here like this, but now I can't imagine my life without you in it. I've watched you grow into someone stronger than I think you even realize. And I'm proud of you. I choose you, not because I have to, but because I want to, every day." Eliza felt the emotion well up in her chest, her eyes glistening as she spoke her vows in return. "Michael, you've shown me what it means to live a life that's truly your own. You've stood by me, even when I didn't make it easy. And now, I can't picture this life without you. I choose you because you make me better, and because with you, I finally feel free." They exchanged rings, simple bands that they had picked out together. There was nothing fancy about them, but they didn't need to be. What mattered was the promise behind them. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, again, they both smiled, not just because of the words, but because this time, it felt right. This time, it was real. From a distance, Charles Montgomery watched in silence. He stood at the edge of the property, far enough away that Eliza and Michael wouldn't see him, but close enough to witness the moment. He hadn't been invited, and he knew better than to intrude. His relationship with Eliza was still strained, a mixture of pride and regret that he couldn't quite reconcile. Watching her now, standing with Michael in front of the vineyard, something shifted in Charles. He had spent so much of his life trying to control everything, his business, his estate, and especially his daughter. He had believed that he knew what was best for her, that he could shape her life the way he had shaped his own success. But looking at her now, so full of life and purpose, he realized how wrong he had been. Eliza didn't need his control. She didn't need his power. She had found something far more valuable on her own, her strength, her independence, and a life she had built with someone who saw her for who she really was. Charles turned and walked away, leaving Eliza and Michael to their moment. He didn't need to stay to know that his daughter had grown into someone he could finally be proud of, not because she had followed his plan, but because she had made her own. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the vineyard, Eliza and Michael stood together, watching the light fade into the horizon. The day had been perfect, not because of its grandeur, but because of its simplicity. They walked hand in hand back to the guest house, the place that had once felt like a punishment but had now become their home. The future stretched out in front of them, uncertain but full of possibility. And for the first time, Eliza wasn't afraid of it. Michael glanced over at her as they reached the front porch, his smile soft. "So, what now?" Eliza leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Now, we build something, together." They stood there for a moment, just the two of them, as the last of the light disappeared into the night. There were no grand speeches or dramatic declarations. There was only the quiet understanding that they had chosen this life together and that, no matter what came next, they would face it as partners. It wasn't the life Eliza had expected. It wasn't the one her father had planned for her. But it was hers, and that made it everything she had ever needed. A new beginning. Their beginning.